Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, How to Talk About Racism. My name is Len Rudner. On behalf of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, I am delighted to have you with us today. Before we begin, a few administrative details. Our panelists, soon to be introduced, will each take 10 to 15 minutes to present their thoughts on the topic. At the end of the third presentation, I will return to run the Q&A section of the program. You will have the opportunity to type your questions at any time during the presentations. My colleague and I will group similar questions together in order to make the best use of our time. Please, wherever possible, indicate the person to whom you wish to address your question. That way, we can answer as many as possible. Thank you, and now we will begin. Racism can feel like the problem that won't go away. We spend a lot of time talking about it, but are we really getting better at answering the really important questions? If, as the song says, that you've got to be taught to hate, then what are we doing as parents and friends and citizens to ensure that the lessons of hatred are not spread? How do we educate ourselves? Ask questions that make us feel uncomfortable on such an explosive issue. When being uncomfortable makes us want to turn away, how do we keep ourselves focused and engaged? It's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists. Beginning our session will be Inspector Ricky Veerapan, Diversity and Cultural Resources Bureau, York Region Police. Ricky will be followed by Carrie Ann Eskai, Assistant Professor of Early Childhood Education at the University of Nebraska, but who earned her PhD here in Toronto at OASI. And we will conclude with Mary Gordon, the founder and president of Roots of Empathy. Ricky, I turn it over to you, to our participants and guests. Please enjoy this presentation.
Thank you very much, Len, and hello to my fellow panelists. Hope you're all well. And thank you very much to the Canadian Race Relations Foundation for this invitation to have a member of York Regional Police participate in the panel. My name is Ricky Veerapan. I'm the inspector in charge of the Diversity, Equity, and Cultural Resources Bureau for York Regional Police. My work entails overseeing a diversity outreach and relationship building team with York Regional Police, as well as overseeing a hate crime unit and hate crime investigations for York Regional Police. I guess to start, I should probably just provide some context as to the community that we serve as we get into this question, which will really speak to the rationale for the type of work that we do at York Region. York Region is a regional municipality located directly to the north of Toronto, 1,756 square kilometers, made up of 9 individual municipalities. Within that regional municipality, we have roughly 1.2 million people, with roughly 2/3 of our population living south at the very south end of the region, closer to the border of Toronto. The makeup of our community is really what we see as a reflection of the world. Our community is what we call a microcosm of the world because we have people in our communities who trace their ancestries and heritage to many different parts of, in fact, virtually all corners of the world. And along with this, it adds tremendous value to the diversity and the makeup and the demographics of our community as we showcase culture, cultural diversity, and all of the other wonderful manifestations and human attributes of diversity in our community. Also, along with this, from time to time, we tend to see some of the ugly sides that these human relations tend to bring out. And as I mentioned, my line of work is really working with hate crime. So we see this from time to time playing out within our communities. And the types of hate crime that we deal with primarily are anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, anti-Black, and sort of homophobic types of hate. So the work that we do at York Regional Police is really engaging communities. And how do we combat intolerance? How do we combat xenophobia, prejudice, and hatred in all of its forms? The way we approach this at York Regional Police is to have a hate crime unit and a diversity unit working together in conjunction. The hate crime unit really serves as the outreach and relationship building arm of our organization, while the diversity unit serves as the outreach and relationship building arm of our organization, while the hate crime unit serves as the investigative arm. A lot of the work that we've been doing over the last number of years is focused also on education, where we have offices in schools, working with students, working with communities, and working with various partners in York Region on projects that really showcase and profile the importance and significance of human rights education. The work that we do is sometimes sort of the last line of defense. You know, when you look at all of the various institutions in societies where young people engage, where people engage on various levels, when racism gets to the point where it crosses over into the area of criminality, this is now where the police become engaged. So one of the things that we've been looking at for a number of years at York Regional Police are early intervention approaches. How do we connect with communities? How do we engage communities in integrated approaches to resolving some of these types of issues that can eventually lead to hate crimes? So how do we mitigate this? And some of those approaches have included working at community roundtables, working in partnership with our other policing partners in the Greater Toronto area and nationally as well as many of the cultural, ethnic, religious, and social service agencies that we see within York Region. So I will stop over there, and I will turn it over to our next presenter, Carrie Ann, and hopefully we'll continue the discussion from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you to the Canadian Race Relations Foundations for this invitation. My name is Dr. Carrie Ann Sky. I am an assistant professor of early childhood education at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. My primary research areas are children and race and anti-racism education, as well as whiteness and critical race theory and teaching young children about race and racism. The scope of my discussion today will primarily focus on children and race and using pedagogical approaches to address racism in young children. An ample body of literature shows that young children do recognize racial characteristics starting at the age of 3. An additional body of literature also shows that young children between the ages of 5 and 7, and even as young as 4, exhibit both positive and negative racial attitudes towards in-groups, meaning their own racial group, and out-group members. Much of this literature shows that white children prior to the age of 7 demonstrate negative attitudes for the most part towards blacks, and this is in the Canadian and American context. In contrast, we have found that in studies with black children, including African Canadian children, the findings are somewhat mixed. That is, some studies indicate that black children hold positive attitudes towards their in-group. For example, a Bood study in 1995 showed that finding. And other research shows that black children show negative attitudes towards their in-group. Scholars have attempted to account for these interpretations of these findings in several ways. One theory that has been put forth to account for these findings is the social cognitive theory. This theory indicates that because of immature cognitions, young children will exhibit negative attitudes. Primarily white children will exhibit negative attitudes towards out-group members. The emphasis here is that because young children prior to age 7 do not have the ability to decenter, meaning to consider two perspectives simultaneously, and because of this limitation, they will view out-group members in a more negative fashion. This interpretation, however, does not hold for the findings that suggest some black children holding negative in-group attitudes and positive out-group attitudes. An anti-racism interpretation, in which my colleagues, for example, Rachel Berman and I are working on a paper right now, detailing an anti-racism interpretation of Canadian children's racial attitudes, is that because of the deeply entrenched racist images and racist discourse in Canadian context, in the Canadian society, allows children to construct racialized understandings of themselves and others, black children as well as white children, thereby creating these types of attitudes towards whiteness and blackness in the Canadian context. The implications of such knowledge are located both within parenting as well as educational context. I'll start first with the educational context, given that I am in teacher education, I work with teacher candidates, and we have discussions about these, specifically how to engage young children in discussions about racism, and more importantly, how do we prepare pre-service teachers to enact anti-racist pedagogy so as to not further contribute to educational inequities and these types of racialized images children draw on. So I'll first start with the anti-racism approach from an educational perspective, teaching young children about racism and so on. In contrast to what existing literature says about children, white children specifically, and teaching white children about racism, I would advance the argument that whiteness needs to be named with young children, primarily because this particular identity is normalized and normalized for specific benefits, benefits which white children themselves draw on, to use the Du Bois' term, wages of whiteness, that psychological benefit of your group being perceived as superior. Studies show white children to draw on that by imbibing the notion of white superiority. Now, in order to interrogate this particular perception, we need to name whiteness for what it is. It is an identity rooted in power and privilege, and discussions about racism with young children must include this critical component. That's one step. Name whiteness for what it is. This is not an attempt to rarefy whiteness or to put it at the center of the discussion, but rather to unmask the power relations embedded in the social construction of whiteness. The second step, and which has been grossly overlooked in the existing literature, is to encourage dialogue with white children about systemic racism. Far too often, the conversations for young children revolved around similarities and differences, and that's okay in one respect. However, if the discussions are confined to only differences and similarities between and among groups, discussions about systemic racism and how that operates in different contexts based on power and privilege is then marginalized, which then also leads to a very superficial understanding of racism in the contemporary Canadian context and American context as well. So that's the second step. We need, as educators, to encourage discussions or to facilitate discussions about whiteness, systemic racism, and the context in which these operate. Third, another strategies for educators to use in their classrooms with young children is also to understand that stereotypes, and I'm extending some of the academic discourse on teaching young children about bias and differences, is to extend the discourse on stereotypes by helping children understand or make the connections between the origins of stereotypes, the processes that undergird such stereotypes, and the purpose such stereotypes serve. As I mentioned earlier, prevailing discourses on teaching young children about bias and difference often point to the need to deconstruct stereotypes with young children. However, such approaches are very limited, primarily because they do not offer children the opportunity to learn about how these stereotypes were created in the first place, and how they are located in perpetuating racial oppression. This may be attributed to the emphasis on developmentally appropriate practice. While I agree with some tenets of developmentally appropriate practice, I must also call into question why it is also too often it's used as a means of escaping political anti-racist discussions. And I'm not the only scholar who have implicated developmentally appropriate practice in such analysis of discussing racism with young children. And thirdly, we must help young children to recognize that whiteness and the constructions of blackness, so the stereotypes of whiteness and blackness, occur in tandem with one another. there's a marked difference between teaching white children about racism and teaching racialized children about racism. There are similarities and there's also a marked difference. In contrast to teaching white children, discussions about racism for racialized children should also center on the role of power and privilege in the construction of stereotypes and differences that are attached to racialized groups. It is absolutely imperative then that when we're discussing racism with racialized children, we afford them the opportunity to deconstruct these images about racialized groups, show them how they are connected to white power and privilege, and also give them counter narratives that interrogate and rupture such pathological representations of their racial group. And also how to show, and also one element of that is to show them how power and privilege is embedded in different institutional contexts as well, for example, media, education, and so on. It's a knowledge deconstruction process and an institutional analysis of how knowledge is constructed based on power relations. Those two elements work together and should be included on discussions of racism with children. In terms of parenting, I've mentioned education. I'm now moving on to parenting. Another large body of literature focuses on how parents talk to young racialized children about race, primarily African American. I'm sorry about that. Primarily African American children, although there's research done in the Canadian context as well. Lalonde and James from York University did an excellent article, empirical work on racial socialization in Black Canadian families. However, the bulk of the literature does focus on African American families, and there are different ways in which African American parents socialize their children to understand the social significance of race. One strategy that is predominantly referenced in the literature is preparation for bias, which basically refers to strategies parents use to make their young children aware of racism in the American context. And another strategy is the instilling of racial pride. So parents have discussions with their children about their racial heritage, about the history of their racial background, and so on. There's far less research with white parents and how they communicate knowledge about race to their children. The existing work that is available, however, points to the fact that many white parents are reticent to discuss race with children in the fears of igniting what they perceive as racist belief, and as such, their preferred approach is to remain silent on race. However, as many other scholars have pointed out, to use that approach is also to be complicit in racism, because by being silent, you're not allowing your child, you're not giving the child the opportunity to critically assess and examine the meaning of racism and the meaning of whiteness and the meaning of these images, particularly as they relate to racial oppression in Euro-Canadian and European American contexts. However, it is important to point out the role of intergenerational parenting because, for the most part, white parents may not have that knowledge or tools to discuss racism with their children because their parents did not discuss racism with them. As a result of this, parenting programs should offer opportunities for white parents to discuss racism with their children should they be lacking in the tools and in the knowledge of creating this, of having those discussions or initiating those discussions with their children, because as the research shows and as other scholars have shown historically and contemporary, to remain silent is also to be complicit. And I would hope that white parents, in the interest of their children and children of all different racial backgrounds, their hope is that they address racism in such a way that they do not encourage or support racial oppression for any racialized group. Thank you. And I'll now turn it over to Mary.
very interesting, and thank you, Ricky, also for your remarks, and to Len, thank you for the invitation to the Canadian Race Relations podcast. I'm very pleased to be here, and I guess my background is also with children. The Roots of Empathy organization has programs in elementary schools where we build empathy, and that, in terms of this discussion, is one of the best ways to unravel racism. We also work with Seeds of Empathy in child care centers and nursery schools, and these programs are in every province of Canada and in 11 countries. The idea is that when empathy goes up, aggression, violence, bullying, all those negative things go down, and children's pro-social behavior goes up, and that means including, sharing, caring, basically all of the things that will define or undermine racism. So it's in that context I'm happy to speak with you today. I think probably to go back to one of the remarks that Ricky made, you're dealing with Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and xenophobia. So is everybody. We just don't realize it. And at least you're doing something in a very practical way. And I think back to 9/11, and I was walking down Parliament Street in Toronto shortly after that, and there was a mother with two little children who appeared to be about kindergarten age, twins, taking them over to Lord Dufferin School. And a man came up behind me and behind her and pushed her, telling her to go back to where she came from. He hadn't even seen her face. He was making an assumption. And that just rocked me so much that I found an imam, and I spoke to the imam, and I said, we have a program that works with parents, usually mothers and little infants, as a way to help children find the humanity in the little baby and then in themselves, and that the program started in Toronto, and we would love to reach out to some of the Muslim mothers and have them come in and be a model of empathy in the classroom, and as a way to chip away at the racism that this group was experiencing. And to pick up on one of Carrie Ann's points about stereotypes, we found that by bringing these mommies and babies into classrooms in elementary schools in Ottawa and in Toronto, it took about 20 minutes before you smashed the stereotype that the teachers had about who are these women who are so covered up. In one case, all you could see was the mother's eyes. It just took the Roots of Empathy instructor, who's not the teacher, who's someone external to the community, to say to the mother, could you please share your favorite song that you sing to your baby? And at the first bar, she had us all. So there is something that makes us exquisitely human in our babies. And we use this parent and baby relationship, this first relationship in life of attunement and attachment, as the model for teaching. It is the most empathic relationship of the lifetime, but it is also for many children who may not have had empathic parenting for no particular reason, not to blame or shame anyone, but we do know that if in the first 2 years of life a baby hasn't been responded to empathically, it's very difficult for them later on to feel how others feel, because they can't acknowledge how they feel themselves. Their feelings haven't been connected through the parent. So bringing in this model of a parent and a baby over the entire school year with a curriculum that's age appropriate to the little children and with a local parent and baby, you give children experiential learning that allows them to consider what makes us human. What is it? How are we different from the people on the other side of the mountain? How are we different from the people on the other side of the ocean who maybe look different, who sound different, who eat different food, enjoy different music. So what we do in Roots of Empathy, rather than talk about race, we talk about difference and we talk about sameness. And our sameness in the world and the common core of our humanity is our shared feelings. And that really is, I guess, the language of our feelings is our Esperanto. It's how we all start in life. It's how we all finish in life. It defines us as people, the relationships that we are able to build because we are able to feel. And I think the idea of teaching children empathy or helping them develop empathy as an answer to how we can stop, arrest, or prevent racism from happening is palpable. And we've done the program, my golly, it's about 21 years ago I started Roots of Empathy, and started it particularly with parents who represented minority groups, so that children in classrooms could see that whoever the mommy was who came in is just like their mommy. And of course they do. That the mommy would explain how she chose the name for the baby, the mommy would explain how tired she feels and what it's like when the baby won't stop crying, and all the various things that the mother would share at the coaching of the Roots of Empathy instructor, so that it really was an incredible example for children to speak to a parent about what is it like to be a parent, and to then have, over the course of an entire school year, to have a class the week before the mother came and the week after the mother and baby came, to predict and to project, so that the children learned very much how they felt themselves from being coached to observe how they think this little baby felt. And we expand the children's emotional vocabulary. And quite honestly, in life, it's equally as important as the vocabulary we need to learn to read and write. It is the vocabulary we need to relate. And I think in this world we have a crisis of connection. And if we can support children in developing empathy, and I simply mean by that the ability to understand how another person feels and to feel with them, that is a break against cruelty. That is a break against racism. If you really do understand that we are the little baby who sits on a green blanket with all the children gathered around, and the children are coached to observe the baby's intentions, perspective taking, that's the cognitive aspect of empathy, and also the baby's feelings. The children, to the very last child, every single one of them, fall in love with that baby. They find themselves in that baby. And then to say to them, are we not all just bigger babies? How would you feel if somebody said, when our little baby goes to school, somebody said, you can't play, you've got the cooties? Well, the outrage is palpable. So what children understand in Roots of Empathy is that we are all the one. We may look different, but we share the same array of feelings, that we have different levels of intensity in how we feel, but that what makes us one is that we all share the same feelings. And I think that whole idea of allowing children to ask questions without stopping them, you know, they interrogate the parent, and authentic questions. We have completely authentic dialogue in these programs because we never ever praise the children for their questions or their comments, and we never tell them anything. We only ask experiential questions. What do you notice? What do you recall? Was there a time when? All related to them. There's no one right answer. And by not praising the children by saying, oh, Carrie Ann, what a brilliant question, or Ricky, that was a wonderful answer, Ricky and Carrie Ann feel marvelous and everybody else feels nervous. So that the children who want the approval of the adult, they are not paying attention. They're just waiting for a chance to shine. Or they decide to disappear altogether because they don't want to compete. But when you have motivation that is intrinsic, it is the child who is making the decision. And I can tell you, the decision that little children make about what they think and what they say is far more important than any adult's judgment of that. And the other side of praise, of course, is criticism. So I want to stop here so we have lots of time for discussions, but I'm really interested in the very different perspectives. And maybe one little thing I'll say, I'm just back from the UK, and I had been in Northampton where we have a partnership with the police. Now, can you imagine? The police give us some of the officers to train in roots of empathy. And we've done this in Canada with our CMP officers, so that you have this, in most cases, male authority figure coming into a classroom and interacting with a tiny baby. So you win battle after battle after battle. And I think the beautiful thing that happened in Northampton, because I was speaking with the police, they felt that they had broken stereotypes that community might have had of them, and that they had a much deeper insight into how little children thought and felt. And so I just wanted to share that particularly, Ricky, with you before we start further discussion. Back.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Carrie, and thank you, Ricky, for sharing your thoughts with our audience. We'd now like to use the time that remains to take questions from the audience. We've received a few through the WebEx, but please do use the Q&A function that's available to pose your questions. We've also received a few questions via email, so let's take a look and see what we have. The first question, I suppose, is one that can be addressed to each of the panelists, should they care to comment. We have, in fact, looked at the problem of racism from the point of view of adults, through Ricky's perspectives, through the way that infants and children are introduced and learn about the topic through Mary and through Carrie Ann. But what about folks in the middle? How do we prevent racism and promote a discrimination-free environment in other areas, for example, communities, schools, and universities? So whoever would like to go first, and whoever would like to follow up.
Len, I guess I'll start with that. So youth engagement, and I guess this is an area that really looks at youth engagement. As I said previously, we from a policing perspective, we see racism at a point in society where it's often crossed the lines into criminality, where we're dealing with hate crime, and so taking it backwards. So how do we engage young people? How do we engage other partners in collaborative efforts to really try to deal with some of the root causes of it, right? As I mentioned earlier in my introduction, early intervention is something that we sincerely believe in. The approach is that there has to be some type of foundational human rights type training, right? Human rights training, just to provide a framework, and human rights intervention at a very, very early age, where students are learning about human rights, because if they have a framework on which to build all of these different types of experiences on, I guess it's something that they'd be able to use to weigh and balance some of the dilemmas that they often face as they grow. So from a policing perspective, we do a lot of work with schools in York Region, in our jurisdiction. We have offices that engage at the high school level. We've done that for over 25 years in York Region. And there are many other jurisdictions and other policing partners across Canada that employ the same types of approaches. So youth engagement is important. But again, going back to that early intervention approach, I'm a huge supporter of early intervention when you look at, in the very formative years, in the ages when children are influential, how do we engage and how do we train the mind? And Mary, I was watching one of your TEDx talks, and I really like the phrase you used about teaching the hearts. And I think sometimes we focus a lot on teaching the minds, but I really do like that phrase of yours, teaching the heart, and how do we do that? So I'm very interested in learning a little bit more about your work with the other police services and how we could possibly collaborate on that.
Oh, that would be just lovely, Ken, and we'll be sure to catch up after. I just would like to weigh in on your question there, Len. Earlier on in my life, I did a lot of work with parents. And in Leslie Ann's presentation, she spoke a lot about the role of parents in discussing racialization with their little children. But one of the things I found in working with parents and their babies to preschool age, I set up, my golly, back in 1981, I'm very long in the tooth, but in 1981 I set up the Parenting and Family Literacy Centers that are now policy in Ontario. And the idea was to bring parents from the communities where we had the lowest performing academic performances of the children. Well, good morning. Wasn't that where we had the highest levels of poverty? Wasn't that where we had the highest levels of new immigrants? So there was definitely in some neighborhoods race wars afoot. I know we had every school in Regent Park, we had a parenting and family literacy centers. And I can tell you sometimes in the first day of the term, it was pretty hot stuff. But what we did find that when the parents would work together or play together with the children, we built in intentionally through our staff an opportunity for parents to share their experiences and to have dialogue in the moment so that it wasn't talking about them, it was us. And those parents really had an incredible bond with one another. The children are always wonderful, preschool children, and Carrie Ann was saying by 3 they start noticing race. I mean, that was that gorgeous video that went viral about a little kindergarten boy who thought he'd trick his teacher by having his hair cut, this little white boy, by having his hair cut to look just like his little black friend, not realizing that the teacher could see that they're different colors, but the haircut would definitely fool her. So the absolute beauty of little children to open their hearts and to love without borders and boundaries, to have them all together and to have their parents there and to see how that works. We had some very difficult discussions about history. But I can tell you that those parenting and family literacy centers were amazingly inclusive places where apartment buildings changed, where communities changed, where you would have people offer to help one another, take one another's children in. It was just an amazing melting away of the external differences that allow us to be racist. And you even had one day, we nearly had war. We had a woman from Israel and we had a woman who just come from Egypt, and they were both newcomers. And they both had family histories of loss. And it took 2 weeks before they were having coffee at one another's house. So I think there are, and again, it's interesting, these parenting centers were in schools because schools really are our ministry of peace. All of the children go there in developed countries. If you want to make sure that no child gets polio, you better be giving the inoculations out at school. So if we inoculate our children against racism at school, hopefully Ron won't be so busy.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for those answers. We have another question. I'm just going to ask one of my friends to pull it up. Okay, so this is a question for you, Carrie Ann. how do we translate your important work and knowledge to the broader community? What have you found to be the best way to translate this content for folks outside of academia?
I would say to translate that work and the importance of that work, community collaborations are absolutely essential. For example, having events where the community members are invited. I recently did an interrogating of Black images masculinity event in which community members were invited to attend at the University of Omaha, Nebraska. And as part of this process, we used a critical race theory methodology in that participants, members from the community, were invited to share their counter-narratives about images of Black masculinity. And as part of that process, I also emphasized to all the attendees that the knowledge we have discussed here, the stories we have disseminated, should not be confined to the walls of the academy. We need to go out and as a collective inform others about this knowledge, share stories about our experiences, and collectively work to institute change in institutional context as well. So I believe working with community and grassroots organizations and bridging the gap between the academy and grassroots organizations and organizations dedicated to activism is absolutely essential.
Thank you very much, Carrie-Ann. We have another question that's coming via email. Mary, this is for you. I'm paraphrasing. The name of your organization, Roots of Empathy, is suggestive, but it gives me a bit of a problem. Is it really possible to know how others feel? Even a universal event like the death of a parent affects people in different ways. Knowing how I feel should make me more sympathetic and even compassionate. But does Roots of Empathy hope for more than that?
Yes, thank you for your question. We absolutely hope for more than that. We want empathy action. And I think the thing is we, with our little children, sometimes don't share what we're thinking. And we know that critical analysis comes through, with many children, through the exposure to discussion. And in Roots of Empathy, what we do is sort of guide the children's attention to what's going on with this little baby so that they can appreciate the cues, the emotional cues, and recognize them. And this is completely translatable to reading their friends and understanding themselves. So they're getting the words, they're getting to recognize the cues. And you know, we say to the children that it's not your fault if many things seem unfair, but if there is something unfair in front of you and you think you can do something about it, you have the moral courage to do it. So it's about empathy and moral courage. And, you know, whether or not we can really understand completely what a person is feeling, I would say no. But if you can read what a person looks like and see that a person looks sad and be able to say to that person, are you sad? And children do this. The person very often is broken free so that they can then connect. And this ability of being able to connect to another person, we call it limbic resonance, that it is deep in your brain, the limbic system, which is at the core of our feelings. It is required that we learn how to connect with another person, because you mentioned compassion and sympathy. You can't get to compassion without empathy. Sympathy is just feeling sorry. It's not very deep. But empathy is the whole palette of feelings. It's feeling joy with one another. It's feeling nervous for one another. It's feeling frightened for one another, feeling sad. It's the whole gamut. I mean, even in classrooms after Roots of Empathy, children will tell you, I felt very embarrassed for Johnny. I mean, that is unheard of. So I think empathy is not really like a muscle, but it's something that, kind of like riding a bike. The more chance, you don't ever forget, but the more chance you get, the better you get at it. and along with language, we'd have at least a bridge to the experience of the other, and it allows the other to connect with us, and we have a crisis of connection in society. So I don't think we can ever know if we feel exactly like another person, and sometimes it's insulting to say to someone who's suffering a tragedy, I know how you feel. It's okay to say, I feel with you, but not to completely know how they feel. And I don't know if that answers the question. I'm prepared to go another round if it doesn't.
So, Mary, thank you very much. Okay, we have another question. Ricky, this one is for you, sir. Policing in northwestern Ontario brings challenges in regard to racism, having our Indigenous people being the highest represented peoples in our jails, but the lowest represented in our population. Do you have any tips I can bring back to my officers to help us bring back trust to our Aboriginal communities?
Excuse me. Within the province of Ontario, we have a provincial diversity. Excuse me a second. Within the province of Ontario, we have a provincial police diversity network. The province also has the Ontario Association of the Chiefs of Police, which actually is the foundation for this network. We have a similar network that focuses on hate crime, which is the Hate Crime Extremism Investigation Team for Ontario. Perhaps I'd be able to share my contact information with you, Len, and would be able to elaborate further and provide some of the details on this. But again, we look at the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation report from Justice Sinclair, and there are tremendous lessons in that report relating to this specific topic. And although there's nothing in that speaks, it speaks about the justice system. It speaks about education. It speaks about governance. It speaks about a number of areas. There are things that all of those areas and all of those calls to actions that are available for us to learn from. So, in terms of answering the specific question about the northwestern region of Ontario, if the person that sent the question in is a police officer or a member of the public, I'd be very happy to share my contact information and talk about some of the programs that we do. We have things that work in York Region for us, and the Ontario Provincial Police, and there's a number of other policing agencies out in northwestern Ontario. There's also Aboriginal policing programs in those areas that can speak to policing issues. When you're talking about the correction system, you're talking about the justice system. Those are other separate links to the long chain, and they may have different ways that they would respond to that question. But ultimately, again, I believe a lot of it is based on education for police officers, for police members, for members of our communities, as to understanding the elements of the Truth and Reconciliation report, as well as adding to that components of human rights education. And again, these are some of the things that we see sort of at the end of this chain of racism, where it crosses over into the area of criminality. Some people maybe face convictions regarding hate crime, and then you have people going into the correction system. I also like to look at the preventative piece and what are the areas that we can work on, really focusing on early intervention. So there's got to be a multi-pronged approach. We certainly have to have police officers. We have to have the ability to respond to violations against people's rights and against their safety and security within communities. But simultaneously, there should be efforts in the schools and even in early intervention stages to divert this. And how do we do that? And listening to Dr. Carey and incredible analysis on the breakdown of racism and some of the root causes of racism and some of the findings and academic research on racism. I think all of these things are very, very necessary in the education that, for all of us in this particular area. So Len, I would share my contact information with you, and perhaps we could send that out and have it available for someone to contact me personally, and we could talk about some of the other avenues that we could address this question.
Len, I'd like to also add something to Ricky's comments. The overrepresentation of our indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system is the same thing in New Zealand. Also, the overrepresentation of indigenous children in the Children's Aid Societies, the child welfare system, same thing in New Zealand. Both countries were blighted by colonialism. The suffering of our indigenous people because of the generational racism, as shown most dramatically by the residential schools and then latterly the 60s scoop, has not only damaged the people at the time, but damaged generationally. And because of our new sort of awareness of brain development, there have been generational harm done. And there's an amazing study that would give a lot of understanding and take judgment away from this. There's a childhood adversity study called ACES, A-C-E-S. And what it does, it's Dr. Vince Valletti did this study, and it was really a public health study looking at obesity, but what he found out was that it was adverse early childhood experiences caused terrible problems in adult life in both their health and in their social and emotional development, and of course obesity being one of these things. But they found that out of 10 risk factors, one of them would be adversity, one would be a parent in prison, one would be some element of physical or sexual abuse, either directly to the child or domestic violence in the home. So those kinds of questions, if a child had more than 4 checks out of those 10, the child was 480 times more likely to have pulmonary heart disease and lung disease as an adult, but they were more than 1,200 times more likely to commit suicide. Well, I mean, that is a most disturbing situation. And what do? We blame downstream instead of seeing what happened when the brain was vulnerable and developing in the early years. So, you know, it was back, I think, in 2006 that Helen Clark, who was the then Prime Minister of New Zealand, talked to me about bringing roots of empathy to break the cycles of domestic violence and child abuse that she said her government had meted on to the Maori and Pacific Island people through denigrating their language and culture. Well, didn't we do the same thing in Canada? So I think there are huge lessons about the deleterious impact of the experiences of children when their brain is still very sensitive to the social and the emotional environment. So it's helpful for the police officers who are working with these problems of criminality or mental illness or addictions in adults to go back to see not what's wrong with you, but what has happened to you. And I think all of us need to be a little aware that however we develop, we have to roll back and see what happened when we were little.
Thank you very much. Thank both of you for those very complete answers. We have a question which I think can be answered by all of the panelists if they wish to. Very often, people think that when we discuss racism and racial discrimination, we see it as an us versus them conversation. Do you have any advice on how to persuade different groups that we all play a role in solving the problem of racism?
Len, if I could just, I'll just touch on that, but just on something very particular. Sometimes, and this may not only be in terms of racism, but also in some of the types of issues and dilemmas that we deal with in policing from time to time. And sometimes even in the language of human rights and understanding of human rights, it seems that we sometimes tend to use the same vocabulary, we tend to use the same language, but our interpretation of those meanings are different. And sometimes, you could have groups of people that are using the same language, that are using the same vocabulary, but have absolutely different interpretations as to what it means. There's a saying. It goes like, human rights is not a buffet where you can choose some things and not others. If you believe in human rights, you believe in it for all people, right? So it's not conditional. It's not subject to interpretation. And I think sometimes the starting point for getting groups of people, particularly sometimes in the work, in my line of work, where we see, where we may see sectarian conflict, where we see racial or ethnic conflict playing out in some communities, sometimes due to current situations happening around the world, and you see the impact locally, sometimes due to historical animosities. I think sometimes the starting point is to look at the language that we use and understand that that in order for us to proceed, we need to have the same understanding of the same vocabulary and understand it the same way in order for us to make progress.
Yes, and I'll just like to extend on Ricky's point in terms of the language and clarification. In my own work, specifically in teaching pre-service candidates about racism, what I've often encountered is this very limited understanding of what racism actually entails. More specifically, for white students, they tend to have the view that racism is limited to individual beliefs in regards to prejudice, bias, and so on. Less often, however, do I encounter students who have a more focused or comprehensive analysis of racism, and one which includes the systemic component, historical component, and so on. So I believe that one way to address this is to have a clear understanding that racism involves power. And with reference to the last line of that question, we all play a role in solving the issue. Racism is a white problem. It was created and is created, perpetuated, maintained by the dominant group who hold privilege and power. Having said that, however, I do believe there's a place and opportunities for interracial allies. Whites can be allies to blacks and other racialized groups in combating racism. However, I do believe that it's important to emphasize that the voice of this, the subjugated voice, must take center of such collaboration. So while whites can do anti-racism work, the narratives, the voice, and the experiences of the oppressed must take precedence. And it must, the reality that this issue or this problem is a white construction must also be highlighted. And I think these are two elements that should be the center of any approach or any discourse related to addressing racism in terms of allies and in terms of fostering positive interracial groups relations.
Mary here. I'm thinking back with your question to the late 90s. I did some work in South Africa with Nelson Mandela's Foundation. And the one thing that kept coming up, and at that time they were really looking at the concept of integration of black and white children going to school together. And it was one of the meetings that I was at in a church. One of the women said, racism is about believing that the other race, whichever it is less human than you are. And I thought it was a profound thing to say, because to be racist is to believe that the other is less equal in some way. And generally speaking, I do believe it is in their humanity. They're not as sophisticated, they don't feel as deeply, they this, they that, the other thing. But if you look at the recent huge increase of anti-Semitism, as seen by the devastation of gravestones and also mosques getting defaced, this whole, it's a xenophobia thing, I think, that people are scared if they feel that their group is going to be overwhelmed by another group, or as you say, Carrie Ann, is going to be more powerful than their group. And I think probably the only way that we can get at that insecurity is to get people doing things together, not for themselves, but for the good of somebody else. And I've seen wonderful things happening since we've had the Syrian refugee children. I've seen it in Northern Ireland, I've seen it in the Netherlands, but I'm seeing it now, thank you, in Canada, that where we work involve the Syrian mothers and babies in our programs. When you get a community coming together to sponsor a Syrian family, you have all groups coming together, but because you're caring outside of yourself and you're doing something together, it really makes a difference. You can relate to that person because you're in the same role, so to speak. So I think we need to find ways that we can come together in society to be helpful to someone who's vulnerable, whether it's getting a neighborhood getting together and putting a skating rink or putting on school lunches or whatever it might be. We need to do things together where we can laugh together, where we can work together, where we can be frustrated together. And that, I think, is a leveling field.
Thank all of you for those responses. The next question, I suppose, is directed primarily to Carrie Ann, excuse me, and to Mary, and perhaps is really an extension of your more recent comments. How do we navigate and integrate empathy into a critical anti-racism approach to individual instances of racism and to the systemic racism that we find in Canada?
You want to go ahead, Carrie Ann?
Empathy with regards to individual racism. Just taking notes of the question.
Okay. Just one moment. We're just going to pull up the question again. Okay. Yes, sorry. How do we navigate and integrate empathy into a critical anti-racism approach to individual instances of racism and to the systemic racism that we find in Canada?
In terms of individual racism, while I do believe empathy can play a significant role, I do think it has its limitations because there is a particular experience that a racialized bodies encounter that regardless of the empathy or the connection, it would not be the same as what the other individuals experiencing, and that is what we refer to as the saliency of experiential knowledge, particularly when it's embodied by a particular racial identity. So I do believe there are limitations. Empathy can help you understand in some respect what the other persons may be feeling, but my issue with taking only that empathetic approach is that then how will it challenge you to interrogate the issues related to systemic racism? Now, the question is asking, how do we take empathy into issues of systemic racism? One approach could possibly be, how would you feel if this power and privilege that is embedded in institutional and systemic contexts is only experienced by your group and not other groups? If you were to have all of this privilege taken away, how would that make you feel? And I do believe that's one step into somewhat elucidating the unequal distribution of power relations as manifested in systemic context. But like I mentioned earlier, I think the empathy approach of that framework could only go so far because of the deeply rooted embeddedness of experiences related to racism, related to racial oppression. What I would argue is an integration of the empathy, but also more in-depth analyses of how racism functions and the psychological violence of racism, as well as the material effects of racism on racialized bodies. I think these need to work in tandem. And again, as I mentioned earlier, using the empathy approach by itself is not sufficient.
Mary here. The thing is, using an empathy approach, you can't just hold up a flashcard and deal with empathy with adults or systemic empathy, systemic racism, I beg your pardon. The thing is, empathy is something that is only developed experientially. You can't just go for an empathy course and think you're going to develop empathy. I mean, there's a whole new money-making machine out there for developing empathy apps and empathy videos and empathy games. And the truth is, empathy is a transactional thing as it develops. And of course, metaphorically, it develops at the breast. The idea is that your experience, your brain develops and becomes empathic based on how well you are being connected to those who are caring for you when you're little. And to take an empathic approach to systemic racism, I'm not sure what that would really transpire to, but there is no question that we cognitively can learn to take the perspective of others, and that's something that you can do in group work or lectures or the drama manipulations or mirroring or any of these things. That is a very different thing than the affective side of empathy, which is about emotion. And you don't really have full empathy until you have both the cognitive and the affective side of empathy working together. And then on top of that, the so what. So you understand, now so what? You have to be able, you can't be an armchair empath. And the thing about people who really do understand what the other person's experience must feel like and have the capacity to actually embody that, these are people who are motivated to do something. And I think there is huge systemic racism that is not necessarily being addressed. A lot has been done, I think, in the field of business around, and in governments actually, in universities, around women's rights and equity. And I think we better not forget about racism and all of that. The whole issue of equity is not just about pay, it's about everything. And we have periods, I think, in history where it's more popular to be speaking of women's rights or children's rights or racial rights or whatever, but I think we probably don't look at our institutions deep enough and think about, okay, here's a hotbed that is the policies and practices are supportive of racism rather than inclusion.
Okay. Thank you, Carrie Ann. And I'm sorry, Ricky, did you want to add anything, or?
Just, I want to just touch on a point that was, and I think it was Mary. It was Mary that had talked about, doing things together, or maybe it was Carrie Ann. Sorry, one of our panelists talked about doing things together and the importance of building those connections. One of the things that we've been doing, and I'll just give one example. At York Regional Police, as I say, we work with many, many communities, a broad spectrum of diversity, which, as I said, we see as a microcosm of the world. And we recognize that conflict and many other sometimes issues tend to move people apart. One of the things that we've been doing at York Regional Police for over the past 15 years is the commemoration of the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Now, we see this as a very, very unique opportunity. This is an event that's hosted by York Regional Police. We recognize that there's a huge international campaign that goes along with it. And although it's celebrated on the 21st of March every year, every day is an opportunity to combat racism and discrimination and hatred in all of its ugly forms. So we've been hosting this event. We have an event coming up on Sunday, April the 2nd, which will be our 15th annual event. The idea behind this event is to collectively stand and speak out against racism, hatred, prejudice, and all of its ugly manifestations, while at the same time recognizing the strength of our diversity. So we've had tremendous community support on this over many years. But again, the point is that those connections are critical. There are things that sometimes come into the pre-criminal space, where, you know, from a policing perspective, you can look at some of these occurrences and incidents in our communities that are based on racist actions and racist incidents. And you know if it goes a little further, it's going to become criminal. It's going to be a criminal offense. But then how do we engage at that level in the pre-criminal space, where police officers and policing is an equal partner at a community table or a resiliency table, where we could have an equal stake at that table to try to deter or try to veer these types of incidents to appropriate agencies and appropriate areas within our communities that can deal with this before it crosses into that line of criminality. So again, I would stress the importance of relationships and integrated approaches to dealing with some of these very, very contentious issues in our communities.
Okay. Thank you all for answering that question and for your participation on the panel this afternoon. I'm very conscious of the time. I committed to the speakers that we would go perhaps as late as 2:15, but that I would get everybody out on time. And more or less, that's what we've done. Just a couple of points. Ricky, you were kind enough to offer to have your email shared with the participants. I'm sorry, with the audience. And if you are okay with that, then that's what we will do in the next day or so.
Thank you.
Okay, and Mary, you had referenced an ACEs study, if I caught it properly. If that is available online anywhere, if you can send us the link, then we can again share that via email.
It would be great. Yes, I can absolutely do that.
Okay. And Carrie Ann, not to leave you out, but your presentation and your passion came through very clearly on this. And if there is something online which you think would be of interest to our audience, if you could send us the link, again, we will share that with everybody who joined us today.
And I could also share my email address with participants as well.
That would be great. Okay. And so folks, thank you to our panelists, to Mary and to Carrie Ann and to Ricky, and thank all of you for joining. We had as many as 75 people online at the same time, and 69 of you stayed right to the end. We appreciate your interest, your passion, and the questions that you asked. Thank you all, and good afternoon. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.